Hello, hello, everyone. Welcome to the live stream. As you guys jump in, I see a bunch of you guys are already here. As you guys jump in, let us know in the chat where you are chiming in from. We have people, oh, Nola, yes. So let us know where you guys are chiming in from. I am so happy to have this long overdue presentation with Precious. I have known Precious. We were just talking about that before we started. Oklahoma City in the house, Maryland. Okay. We were just talking about how we've known each other for about 6 years now. We met at a swanky marijuana party in the Hamptons.
Yes, we did.
It was pre-COVID. I remember we were having parties back then. And ever since then, I've just been following your journey, seeing how impressive everything has been girl fanning you a little bit along the way. And I'm so happy to have you. So just a little bit about Precious, if you haven't seen all the numerous emails and posts that I've put out there. But she is a nationally recognized, award-winning cannabis entrepreneur and advocate. And she's going to tell us her brand story. So she started off with a company called Roll Up. And then, she was very transparent and open, and it was a difficult process getting licensing and things. And she moved on to start a brand called Precious. And that is the reason why, that's part of the reason why we have her today, because we haven't had any discussions about brands and what that looks like and how we can help them as an accountant in licensing agreements. There's just so much involved with brands. So we'll get a little bit of an inside scoop of how to do brands. We got people from Chicago, New Jersey, Colorado, Indiana. Okay, awesome. So thank you so much for being here today with us, Precious.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Naomi. This is like full circle. I know every time we kind of get together, it's full circle because we did meet all those years ago when it was like a different cannabis industry. Oh, and Hey, everyone. Shout out to everyone coming from around the country. Shout out to New Jersey. But no, I'm so honored to be here. Thank you for having me. You're probably one of the few people who've experienced like all my many pivots and all of the up and downs, because we have to consistently like remorph ourselves in this industry. So thank you again for having me.
Yeah, and that is a testament to a lot of people. It's okay to change your mind. That's something that, I struggle with. You decide, oh, this is what I want to be when I grow up. And you go to college and you get this degree and you're like, I don't know if I want to do this. But then you have to give yourself permission to do that pivot. And that's just what life is about. Life is about the pivots. Sometimes, you experience new things. So we will learn about that today. So just tell us a little bit about your journey and your background, like how you even got started in the cannabis industry, and then, what led you to finally founding Precious, your cannabis company.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think like most people, you didn't ever expect to end up in cannabis. Like cannabis usually finds you. My journey actually started back, I would say, in 2016, which is crazy to think that that's coming up to a 10-year mark now, right?
Yeah.
Before cannabis, I was a practicing journalist. So I was a news producer working in local news, also did some national news. And I was actually studying at Columbia University Journalism School when at the same time back, our governor was running on weed and wages for the state of New Jersey. And I kept saying to myself, well, that's an interesting kind of like tagline slogan, weed and wages. So then I focused a lot of my work in journalism school on cannabis, on the industry, on the prison industrial pipeline system, on the harm it's caused, on the war on drugs, on the science of it. It was kind of like I managed to make my journalism program there at Columbia all about cannabis. And it was actually really interesting for my professors because no one had actually taken that kind of lens before. And that's how I sort of self-taught myself. At the same time, trying to help New Jersey legalize later on. That took a couple more years. But then after bringing all that understanding, knowing that there needed to be a lane for equity, starting to really define out what equity looks like throughout different states, bring that information to New Jersey, to how we were building that, and wanted to make sure it had one of the most equitable advantages for people of color, veterans, women, minorities to also join the industry. So that was really how I started, always through that advocacy lens. And then while there, I had a really good friend of mine who was always interested in cannabis delivery. So we started our first company called Roll Up Life Inc., which was a CBD delivery company, which we said, why wait at the time? Mind you, this is before all of the hemp conversations. So please, again, different time. We were able to freely move CBD all around New Jersey. We used that as a proof of concept to build out what is now the delivery license here in New Jersey. And slowly but surely, we just kept building. We raised money. We pitched throughout the country, won a lot of pitch competitions, really just started to figure out what was the best way to enter this industry. You don't have access to traditional capital. You didn't have access, sometimes even traditional accounting or banking. So I feel like we really were around one of those first people on the East Coast to try to figure these things out. But I was also passionate about using our process as like a storytelling situation. So bringing that journalism back hat on, you mentioned I was transparent. It was difficult because you're illuminating not just the wins that you can possibly see all the time in cannabis, but like the hardships. I was not afraid to let people know this is actually extremely hard. If I was to take the same amount of energy and build like a paper company and distribute it through Targets, I would have a way better, a way better time succeeding than what we're
Right.
trying to accomplish here in cannabis. I just felt like it would be helpful for anybody else who was trying to pursue cannabis licensing, to just know my story and try to figure out ways to also like, better your chances for licensing. One of those pitfalls we did hit after we raised money and did so many other things, we got into the financials of the delivery license. And for anybody who's worked with folks doing delivery, it's a really complicated license type. It seems like the easier one. It's usually the lowest hanging fruit. It's usually offered up as the equity license, like we've seen in Massachusetts. Social equity operators were able to, apply for delivery licenses first for the first 3 years before anybody else can take delivery licenses. It's always seen get there first and then you can get into the other aspects of the supply chain. But after working with many financial advisors and accountants, delivery is actually very hard to maintain and scale. It's hard to build a strong financial model of it. And at the same time, we were watching some of the major delivery companies in cannabis start to pivot into retail. They needed to have and own other aspects of the license of the supply chain to kind of make that financial model work for just delivery only. Again, not saying it's not doable, it's just quite tricky to accomplish at scale. So we tried to go after a dispensary license in my hometown, and we did all the things, all, property securing, application, consultants, engineering, everything you can think of to get a really high score on the application. And unfortunately, we weren't able to receive that license. And I was very vocal about it. That was really one of the things I wanted to bring to light. Like you can do all the things to be successful in cannabis, but you're going to be met with other obstacles that you just can't really foresee, whether that's political, whether that's just working with different partners. It can get really dicey. So after that, I had to take a pause and pivot. That's a lot of time, energy, money spent for like a good 5 years looking to build something in cannabis. And one thing I will say after all these years, and I don't want anybody to tell you different, cannabis is a game of speed. I feel like that's something they don't want you to say here because it's like, all right, don't go too fast and fall. You have to be strategic building cannabis companies, but you also have to go fast because it is, some places aren't limited licenses. We're seeing here in Jersey what that looks like. So speed and being an early mover was just so critical for us at that time. So it was very difficult to not have received that license. But pivoting after taking a pause, I also looked into the markets and saw like what was another opportunity that was missing, specifically that impacted women of color. And that was in the brand space. That was all right. There are all these dispensaries, but that was the literal question I asked myself. There are all these dispensaries, but who is making the products in the dispensaries? What are the brands? Like when I go to Marshall's, I know all the different brands that are there. Like I'm in the dispensary. How are these brands being made? I went down that Alice in Wonderland kind of rabbit hole. And then I created Precious, which is a pre-roll brand out in dispensaries in New Jersey. And that's where we've kind of lived now. So that's all of it in a nutshell. But Can't wait to get to talking about the difference in like financials and accounting because it's actually been a saving grace.
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't know if anybody has visited Precious's website or have seen her out at the conferences or even in the dispensaries, but it's a very luxury brand. You got lucky with the name Precious. I mean, where else can you go with that? But yeah, very, very sleek branding and everything. So I love it. And smart move. We got a bunch of accountants on this call right now, and we know from an accounting and tax perspective that the delivery model is the worst model for specifically for 280E taxes to be in. And it's kind of ironic that a lot of states allocate those types, like delivery models, lounge models are, oh, let's make sure all the social equity applicants get these first, when they're not. Obviously they're setting them up for failure because those are hard. And so help us understand a little bit about what's the difference between being a plant touching business to just having the brand. Like, what does that even look like?
280. 280. So that is the biggest difference. And, just shout out to a couple of accountants that's helped me, from Tanika Alexander, I see her here, Angela Mays, like you yourself. Like, they remember when I first called you and I was like, I think I'm interested in this space. I don't know what that looks like, what kind of money I would need to raise. I ended up self-funding because it just was a lighter lift. But no, 280E is the biggest separator. So brands, there's so many different ways to bring a brand to market in terms of deal making. There's, true licensing, where you can work with manufacturers, cultivators, enter licensing agreements, which then create revenue shares, which they take on the onus of being the plant touching entity that's just giving you a rev share. And then you can create an entity that's like separate from anything cannabis related, right? But that you do your operations through. And this allowed for a bunch of different things. This made trademarking a lot easier. This made marketing a lot easier. This made social media a lot easier. This made registering the company a lot easier, just because there is that level of separation. Now, I won't say there isn't connectivity, because again, I am still a cannabis company, so to say, but in the eyes of the law and legally, there is that separation because I don't own a license to actually sell, right? I partner with both. I always think of it like an NIL deal, right? Since those have become super popular, I've essentially given my name, image, and likeness to groups to be able to use. And then for that, enter into a agreement, which I think is an awesome way for building in cannabis, because brands are literally that first layer you see for new people who are entering dispensaries, right? First, they'll see the dispensary, but immediately after, you're perusing products and you're learning about brands. You're understanding, what they're offering, what kind of product it is, what kind of product type, how those interact with exactly what you're looking for. So I thought that was another opportunity to always have some sort of like recognition, to build awareness around industry, to build awareness around women of color being in the industry, is through that brand lens. And now I have a huge level of separation in taxes that I can operate almost like a normal company, right? I say almost because there are things that I still do that safeguard me in that way in terms of banking, but it just gives you the freedom and the wiggle room to use different services, use different tools. And then again, you get to partner with different license holders. And then it's easier to jump states, right? In terms of growing your brand and get into multi-states. You didn't create that separate deal with other licensed companies. And now you don't need to figure out that burden of like carrying if this state has decoupled 280E or not. You literally can operate and do your taxes as normally as efficiently as possible. But there were like, just growing pains when I was first just trying to figure it out, like what my accounting services would look like, what my costs look like, what my expenses looked like. Those were interesting because your margins are a bit smaller. When you're depending on the brand deal you have, which again are flexible. Let's say, for instance, most of the deals I do, my team is in charge of sales and marketing. That's where like we're really good at. We know how to engage communities and events. where now my partners, whether manufacturers or cultivations, they're in charge of labor, testing, packaging, pack out, flower procurement. That's like the brunt of that work. So you can see deals go as far as 75-25 to even 90-10 if you're working with like larger partner MSOs. So the margins there are smaller, but now we're able to probably scale a lot faster because you can build demand for your brand through marketing, being that you can deduct a lot of stuff and now have some of that money come back into your company to continue to build.
Yeah, and that's genius because ever since I started in the industry from 2018, that was something that was always top of mind. Like I'll walk into a dispensary and it looked like I was reading Chinese. Like there was no brand loyalty. It wasn't like I just could recognize things yet because everything was so new. And I always thought whoever can be that first, those first couple of brands like Tylenol, Advil, you recognize that when you walk into a store and like, and trust it. Those are the ones that are going to be the winners. And so being able to have the flexibility to be across the country and then be one of those first brands where people know, hey, when I take Precious, I know exactly how it's going to impact me, how I'm going to feel, all those different types of things. That's the sweet spot. That's where we want to be. And then you can demand those higher margins because now people are asking for your brand to be in these dispensaries.
Exactly. And again, then you're like really looking to optimize your operations. Now you can really focus on scale because you don't have to really focus in on the things that your license holder would usually have. Like those are their issues to kind of control. And like you said, you are like that first introduction, that first layer that folks get to see. The minute you change hearts and minds there and you continue to scale, you can see that there are successful brands just throughout the country. And even on the East Coast now, you're seeing some successful brands start to rise, being that there weren't that many, and we're seeing some come from the West Coast, so on and so forth. It's just been a very interesting space to land. I'm glad that I found it and could take advantage of it.
Yeah, awesome. And then Angela said, looks like she's spreading the word for your brand in Cancun.
Oh, thank
So
you,
maybe
Angela.
market if it ever.
No, and really thank you to Angela. She's one of those people that first sat down with me and helped get my QuickBooks open, just figure out what that looked like, start to, figure out categorizing. And we're hopefully going to get talk about, how you even pay yourself. That was like a tricky area for me, and all those good things. So again, I've had a lot of great people come through and like just offer support and show me how to get this done the right way the first time.
Okay. And so what are your primary revenue streams? Is it just a licensing agreement? Is it wholesale? Is it direct? What is your primary revenue stream?
Yeah, so the primary revenue stream, everything should come from that licensing agreement. It just makes things a lot cleaner because you want invoicing to go through. So that's another thing that just kind of gives you low impact as the brand. And again, every brand can do this differently. There are brands that set up where they'll do their own invoicing. They'll do their own sort of distribution in so many. That's a different rev share number than a brand that doesn't have the capacity to operate in all of those functions. So just thinking about it of a simple clean cut, hey, I can do mainly marketing and sales versus all those things. You really want all that invoicing process to go through your licensee. Because again, 280 and all of those things still have to go through from when product is being made with your cultivator to being sold to the dispensary. And you don't want to be essentially in that. So just to give you that low impact. So after taxes, after that run, that's when you should be able to get your split or whatever your rev share is after net, when it comes to net. Never really gross, but net. So then you do your taxes based on what you've done and what you've spent with your company, which now is a little bit of a lower impact because depending on what you're doing, you're just investing in that sales and marketing arena. So that's one major way. Everything should come directly from your producers just to give you a little bit of space and flexibility. But again, I've talked to brands that are able to do invoicing themselves, but yet still know how to separate 280E taxes and any other tax implications from there. I've known brands that own their own manufacturing, so they are plant touching, right? But yet they have different portfolio brands underneath their manufacturing arm, so they could give themselves a little bit of separation. There's a million ways to dice it, to cut it when you think about it on a brand perspective. I think what I chose was just what worked for me and what I had capacity to do. I didn't want to overshoot it and just shoot straight to the top, try to be in 10 states and do all those things. I just really wanted to incrementally grow the brand in New Jersey, see what it looks like, see the response to it, see what people felt when it came to luxury. Mind you, there's an appetite change in consumption, right? A lot of people I'm noticing are going to different form factors. It's not necessarily just the pre-roll anymore, right? We're looking at drinks, we're looking at gummies, we're looking at low dose because there's a new health conscious era. I think a lot of consumers are in, especially reflecting the dive in alcohol sales. So that is definitely one of the main revenue streams. And then also events, doing your own separate and independent events that, again, you won't have to be hit over the head with Twiggy Taxes as a plant touching company. You can use that as a revenue stream. So like we started to do our dinner series in partnership with the dinner group here in New York, where we would bring people to try our products. It would be a ticketed event. It'd be a 5-course dinner event. You can get tickets by going to the dispensaries, but then we would then actually have a revenue source from those events, and that can then go into the business as well.
Okay. And then when you are doing your so there's two parts to this. You need to get the cultivator or the manufacturer that's going to create these pre-rolls, and then you got to get a dispensary that's going to sell it. Are
Yeah.
you responsible for both of those agreements, or do you just go to the manufacturer and then they're responsible of getting it into the dispensary for you?
So that's another thing that plays into like your rev share, right? Who does what? All right. If I'm the one having to source my own retailers, having to get my own supply agreements with them, having to do my own sales and correspond that's probably an extra leg or lift that the manufacturer doesn't have to do. So you can now play around with what that rev share could look like. But there are cases where it could be easier for your manufacturer, especially if they already have a lengthy sales list and a distribution channel. Let's say they're already in 100 dispensaries, right? Instead of you having to start from scratch to get all those dispensaries, you can definitely work through them and say, hey, since you already have that, put that on your menu, get those sales going. I can bring on additions that might not be in part of that 100, to kind of like bolster that. So there's different ways to skin the cat when it comes to selling, but it really should, even if I bring on a different retailer that's not in their 100 and get a supply agreement, I still have to pass that information over to them because they'll be the ones to fully execute the deal, and execute the sale, right? Because that's the part I want to pass on. But now in Jersey, we also have wholesale licenses that are just coming online, right? So we have middlemen now where they're buying directly from manufacturers and cultivations with different brands. They're holding different brands. They can set their own prices for these brands and now sell to retailers directly. Because how it's done is actually pretty tedious. Jersey, we're seeing almost 250 dispensaries, if not more. Imagine each dispensary having to call cultivators directly, email directly, having to like get menus directly, brands directly. If you guys only seen my email inbox, it's like I had to create a sales one. But that middleman is very interesting because these licenses have just been online, I would say, over the last 3 to 4 months. So we're waiting to see how they'll build up. But now those brands know that they can call those wholesalers directly, right? So now actually is interesting because we're all trying to figure out how do we work with wholesalers? What is that? How does that impact what we've already created in terms of our revenue shares, our way of building our finances? So this is like a third party cut now, right? If they buy directly from us, they would buy it. I would think the point of the wholesale license is that you're selling it a little bit cheaper than what a cultivation or manufacturer would probably sell it at. Because then why would a retailer go to you if they can just skip you and go directly to the source and place an order, right? But they can probably do that at scale because they can say, well, I house a bunch of different brands and I'm saving you time and convenience, right? So that's their offer there. So now just keeping it simple, manufacturers and cultivators can just sell directly to wholesalers. And now a rev share for a brand can come right from there. You don't even have to interface with retailers anymore, which can be really nice.
Got it. And so then when do you get paid? So do you say, hey, you could do 100 items of my brand and pay me in advance, or do you get paid once your brand is selling? Or how does that work?
Oh, that is a great question because everyone know payments in cannabis is very interesting. You know, when you think about terms, you have like net 30s, sometimes net 60s. I hate that. But you know, there is I prefer when I enter deals to have a monthly cadence post sales. So roughly my brand, when we started, we were doing about 5,500 units a month, which equated to somewhere around like $98,000 monthly. This is before the rev share, right? So for that month, if it sold in April, I wouldn't see that until May because most people were either in a net 15 or a net 30 before they had to pay. And these are things that I tell new brand owners, make sure these things are really spelled out in your agreements for when you would like to get paid post, you know, any sort of terms or agreements that you've implemented in supply agreements with retailers. So on a really good situation, you know, you sold product in April, you can see that payment in May. You sold product in May, you can see that payment in June, and you just keep that cadence. Now, there are dispensaries who would take longer or something happened. Of course, there's a millions of situations that happen in the cannabis industry, and some of those do just get pushed back. But it usually should happen in a monthly basis. I know some brands that opted for a quarterly basis, just so like that chunk is a little bit larger and like you can probably have a little bit more flexibility. I know those are for some of the smaller niche kind of drop every now and then brands versus the like consistent, always in market brands. But you can spell that out with your provider.
Right. And then also what I've seen, like with my cultivation clients, there's ebbs and flows when it comes to commodity price. So maybe they're selling a pound for $2,500 one month, and then the next month they can only get $1,500. Do you see that same thing? And it just kind of factors into, you know, whatever the total sales where you just get your percentage based on the licensing agreement?
Yeah, I think one thing I always tell a brand is try to get yourself in a yearly agreement just because you don't know what the next year or the next cycle can bring. Like, for instance, in Jersey, we're starting to see some of that price compression happen because we're seeing more players in the market in terms of cultivation, manufacturers. You know, I'm a 2 gram product that retails around like $32. I saw another 2 gram product come into market that's retailing for about like 26 $24. Like, you have to keep that in mind to know that like people are also in this economy trying to be smart with their buck. And so it is, I wouldn't say a race to the bottom. Jersey has like a lot of runway, especially some good markets. They've managed, you know, price steadiness, but you should prepare for, like you're saying, that drop in a pound. Like, I know like in California, West Coast pounds are now like almost $400 a pound versus
Right.
it's a little bit stronger here in Jersey, Maryland, East Coast area. You're still being able to see some of those $2,600 a pound prices, but it's only because we're still in that like early days limited market. So I think it's something that you want to be cognizant of is to have some flexibility with your pricing. And that's why I think this wholesale license is going to be interesting here in Jersey, right? Because they can buy it from me at my regular wholesale price, but then like do a crazy discount on it to get it to move faster. Maybe that increases volume. Maybe they can purchase more. So it's something to keep in mind. You just have to really be in tune with the market and see where it is.
Right. And then that kind of brings me to another question, and then I just lost it.
That's all good.
Yeah, okay, I'll just go to the next question. So what is your biggest monthly expenses? I can imagine, I'm just wondering, do you have to have a big team of employees, or are you just focused? Obviously, you need an attorney for all these licensing agreements, you need sales and marketing, but where do your biggest expenses fall?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And again, with the brand, it's so asset light. Like, you know, I don't have rent, I don't have utilities, I don't have any like water or anything like that. So it gives me flexibility. Definitely, I would say my biggest expenses for me, because at the time I was taking my first deal, I was paying for packaging, which was interesting. You know, at the time I thought it was going to be feasible for me. My first run, I did about 40,000 units of packaging. If you do the math, I was around 77 cents per unit. So that was a pretty penny to kind of like get started in the game, knowing that like I've sold all of that and like I can make it back. But one thing that I didn't fully think about is that you kind of need to buy packaging halfway through. You can't just like sell through everything and then be like, okay, sold 40,000 units. Let me use all the money that I used to get from that to put a new run, which is close to maybe like, between $30,000 to $32,000 possibly. It doesn't run like that. You kind of have to do that halfway in so that you're never having a gap in market, which I ended up having because I was just like, well, I haven't brought in the cash flow to put a hefty deposit for my next run of packaging. And now we've grown. So I don't need 40,000 units. I need like 80,000 units, which is now I'm looking at a price tag, including shipping, handling, transportation, all the good stuff of like $45,000. So that had me kind of have to take a seat and say, all right, I might need to offload packaging to my manufacturers, which some of them even prefer because they can control that so that they don't have a gap in market. But now your rev share is different. It's quite different, actually, if they're going to take on paying for packaging. So I think during my first year, packaging was definitely one of my main expenses. And I would say slightly my Achilles heel. I think you take on packaging when you're in a better space, when you've seen huge growth and you're probably in your second or third state where you can leverage possible revenue you're getting from one state to pay for packaging in another, and so on and so forth. If you can give that to your manufacturer, some of them even prefer it. Now that I've kind of offloaded packaging with my new suppliers, a lot of my expenses now go to sales and marketing because I'm trying to build the brand, right? I'm trying to make sure people know about it. I'm trying to do events and all that good stuff because that's where a bunch of it could go. We're a team of like 4 really, and a lot of them are contracting for me. So it's just like depending on what I need. Didn't necessarily need this huge staff of people, especially if your manufacturers offers sales support, which is huge, right? So they're already selling products and putting it in dispensaries. You're on their menu. They should be able to sell that because especially if some of them are getting the brunt of it. I like to tell my partners, like, this is your brand as well, right? Yeah. You're going to do well if I do well. So if you just leave me, my little self, to be calling 250 dispensaries a week, we're probably going to have a long day. But if you're calling and your sales teams are calling, we can probably move a lot more product, fast. So, and then legal doesn't get too much because really after those first licensing deals, I didn't have to really tap on legal much more because again, the supply agreements are done with the manufacturer. Their legal team goes through all of that. And that's probably like where they handle it. So if you're doing packaging for sure. If not, you really should be investing that into like your sales and building the brand strategy because that's where most of it goes. So at the end of the day, I really do consider myself a sort of like marketing company at the end of it.
Right. Which is genius because with 280E, we all know sales and marketing is non-deductible. And so the fact that you don't have to worry about 280E and that's, the majority, you don't really have payroll, you don't have rent and all that stuff. The majority of your expenses goes there. That's where we want it to be.
Exactly. But honestly, I think I would have seen a greater year. And again, some of my accountants are on here. They could have told you, I think I would have seen a greater year my first run if I didn't have to pay packaging. Like packaging was probably seeing $5,000, $6,000, $7,000 from me monthly, after I can get a rev share 1 month and bring in like 14K, I'm probably giving like 6, 7 to packaging because I'm trying to get payments up so then I can like put in a new run. So now that I don't have that, I'm excited to see how I can start to reallocate funding and honestly start to build something, right? One thing I think that gets lost in the cannabis industry, because we're spending a lot of time chasing our tails, a lot of people aren't in the black, yet alone the green, right? When we're building our companies. I really want to be able to be a sustainable financial company. That's just one of my like drivers right now. Other than that, this would just be an expensive hobby, right? I want to be able to look and say, all right, this year, after all my expenses, after all my taxes, we are actually positive. We have income there, right? So that there's an opportunity for expansion. Because a lot of folks do say, hey, bring the brand to New York, bring the brand to such and such. I will have the same problems that I'm having in one state in another state if I don't really like get all of those kinks out the way. And again, like going back to what I said, cannabis is a game of speed. But if you can operate quickly while being super strategic and just having great minds around you, I think those are some of the formulas for success, especially on the brand space now.
Right. And I just remembered the question that I lost earlier. The
Yeah.
you mentioned that you were selling yours for like $33 2 ounce, and then you saw something in the market for like $26. How do you keep up with all of that? Like, do you subscribe to some type of data source to know what the pricing should look like? Or are you just in the dispensaries or talking to the dispensaries owners to figure this out? How do you keep up with that?
Yeah, a little bit of both. I definitely do use some providers. Shout out to like Lit Alerts. It's super helpful. That helps me see just kind of like the lay of the land with competitors. I actually made the decision to come down on prices after I saw something like that. So we were wholesaling before at $18 a unit. Now we're at $16 a unit, which I think is just exactly where the market needs to be. It's 3 pre-rolls. Now you're looking at it. Most retailers will sell it at 32. Some might eat the margin, sell it at 30, make it friendly, almost like $10 a pre-roll. But what I've also noticed is that dispensaries are really trying to increase basket sizes. So instead of folks just coming in getting one $10 pre-roll, they try to upsell them with a multi-pack. It was like, well, maybe you could get 3 for 30. So I started to think about it that way. So that helped me make my decisions. And not just what my competitors are doing. I also learned you don't want to just drop your prices because you see someone else dropping. I've also built my brand on being, an elevated brand, a luxury brand that also can be affordable and something can have. So I'm trying to maintain that integrity because I'm also trying to make sure that I'm going to be able to cover all of my cogs with what I'm making, right? So how much I'm putting in for packaging and all this other stuff. Those play into my decision making before I think should drop prices, but you do have to monitor it. If I see someone in the market selling a 2 gram multi-pack for like $16 retail, I'm gonna be like, what's happening? But before I didn't say, all right, I'm gonna sell it for 13 and literally just shoot myself in the foot. There's gonna be a lot of research and R&D that goes into that.
And then you also mentioned earlier that a lot of people are moving into different types of consumption types, different types
Yeah.
of products. How do you handle like product development and figuring out where you want to go? Is it your team, or do you depend on the manufacturers to help you with that?
Really my friends. I call the people that I know and I'm like, so what? Like, I'm a true, like, I will walk down the streets and just ask people, like, what are you consuming these days? I will go out and do my own target market study. I'll go into the busiest city of the busiest street of the busiest anything and just randomly ask people, on top of doing, of course, all of the things, like having some data sources and some R&D teams. Like, for instance, like, I was feeling like I should launch an infused pre-roll, right? One single infused pre-roll, maybe higher in THC. Pricing it though was interesting because I kept asking myself, are people going to pay retail $30 or so for one pre-roll because it's infused? And this is at the time I'm really thinking there is a change in consumer habits around health, right? And consumption. And I looked around and I'm noticing that outside of doing my own target market research, infused pre-rolls were not doing that well in Jersey, right? There's a market for it, right? They're always going to sell to a specific niche market. But then that brought me back to like branding and marketing. I would have to market specifically to that group, right? I don't think that group was casted a wide enough net for me to be like, all right, let's spend all this money creating this new SKU that can only hit like a specific type of like consumer now. Um, so I think about it that way. We're seeing drinks really become interesting, even though like hemp laws are all over the place. The rug could be pulled at any minute, but like we are seeing the drink format. Even me, I was surprised to find like I actually am starting to prefer, consumption via drink versus like even a gummy or something like that, right? So I do spend a lot of time, but I like to go directly to sources, right? I like to just talk to people. I like to find out what they're doing. I don't think I think it's something to be said about the alcohol trend. I think there's a similar trend around cannabis, just like there's dry January. That was like a really tough time in the cannabis market. I think we saw that was one of the lowest selling months for most people in January, where you're thinking there'd be excitement around the new year and everything. But everybody is like, all right, last year was crazy for me. I'm detoxing my whole body. I was actually one of those people as well. I was like, I don't think I want to smoke a single pre-roll this month. So I use all of that as information. So not just, again, doing something because everyone else is doing it, but trying to see what would be super strategic for the company and align with what I'm also trying to put out into the world.
Okay. And then how does so so you have these licensing agreements and you're sending out I guess units, you're not really sending them inventory, but how do
Mhm.
you manage the inventory, like to verify that what they're saying was sold was actually sold, so that you can, have some checks and balances with the licensing agreement and your cut?
Yeah, so inventory is a love-hate relationship. Love because it's not something I specifically manage like through my QuickBooks or anything. I don't necessarily have to do that because I'm not the one specifically moving the units. That's when you just have to have robust communication and transparency with your partners. So that means like weekly reporting, even monthly reporting on sales. So you should have line of sight on how many units were sold. Like if you bought packaging, just even numbers, I bought, 10,000 units or 30,000 units, 10,000 of each SKU because I have three SKUs. In the first month, we've moved, 5,000 divided by, between all three SKUs. I should be able to account for that. So I have my own sort of accounting in terms of inventory. We make sure that matches with what my provider gives me. And if there's any sort of discrepancies, we reconcile them. Now, some discrepancies can happen from sampling, right? I might need to take out samples to go do events and things of that nature. Some discrepancies might happen from sales. So maybe around like 420 or the holidays, we discounted a bunch of product, or maybe even did like a buy one, get one free situation with dispensaries. So that's the part I actually spent a lot of time on, is just making sure that those numbers do reconcile because I don't have that master level of inventory control. But everything also has to go through metric, right? And go through a track and trace system, no matter what state you're in. So that is also a good backup. Make sure that you have an access to metric with whoever you're working with. They could give you access so that they can see the movement of every unit that's moved. So you should have multiple safeguards to check your inventory because I'm not uploading that directly into my QuickBooks and saying, all right, one sale was made here, one sale was made here, so on and so forth.
Okay.
So like
And
love
then
hate because I think if I had to do that, I'd be like, but the
yeah,
tracking of it is important.
and you didn't even mention, but some products might not even sell, or they may even expire, right?
Yes, yes, I've definitely had that problem before. It's literally a brand's worst nightmare. And sometimes it's not even, you can't really blame fault on like product not moving. It's really boils down to policy. Like here in New Jersey, we have a 6-month expiration rule from harvest, which is actually put a tight compression on not just my brand, on so many different brands throughout the state because if you're working with a cultivator or someone like that and they have their own brand per se, let's say they have their in-house brand, they're going to start to get that out the way first, right? After the drying process. Mind you, it's from harvest. So when that's harvested, that timeline starts. They might say, okay, it's time to do your brand, Precious. And that could be maybe 60 days later. Now I've had 2 months less. I have 4 months to now get that sold to dispensaries. Make sure that they understand it's enough shelf life. And then you also got to talk to the consumer because they'll see that expiration date on the back and think like, oh, should I even buy it if it's going to expire really soon? But I think those rules are a little bit arbitrary because traditionally cannabis does have about a 1 year shelf life expiration date. We've seen that in states like Maryland. We're seeing that in other states, Oklahoma. So I think our state just needs to kind of do some investigation into that. And I'm seeing some of that work done. So policy really does impact business because that type of like working under the gun for brands right now, that's one of the biggest issues we're seeing because then you're left with sometimes it's not a lot, but it still puts a dent. You're left with, a couple cases. We're doing cases of 25, a product that's like, all right, this is expiring in maybe like 45 days, 30 days. What dispensary is actually going to want to take the risk to buy? Now you have to probably discount the hell out of it, right? Just to
Right.
get it to sell. And you encounter that problem more frequently now because you want to grow your volume, but now you need to be cognizant of the expiration date. But there are ways I'm seeing people sort of like navigate that. But that's another thing. Policy, depending on your state, can like really impact how you're able to run your business.
Yeah, yeah. This is one of the industries where you have to be involved in politics and policy and all that stuff, or else you will not survive.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And okay, so when we're thinking about like different KPIs and how you're performing, which numbers like are you looking at on maybe a weekly or monthly basis to make
Yeah.
sure that things are going in the direction that you are wanting it to go?
Yeah, I'm always looking at my top line sales numbers because that will let me know like if the brand is resonating or if we're seeing dips there. Like if a retailer didn't reorder this month, like why was that? That kind of helps me before I get into like the nitty gritties and separating like how well the brand is doing month over month. Have we actually grown, right? Did we sell more units? If we started at like 5,000 units for that month, are we now at 6? Are we maintaining 5, which is actually what we ended up doing, which I was actually really proud of for the first couple months because it just showed like steadiness. And this was before we really started to activate getting into more doors and building out the expansion of it. So that just lets me know, number one, if the brand is resonating, not just with retailers, but with end customers. If I'm seeing the same consistent purchases happening each month. And then if it's from the same dispensary, that gives me data on how fast they're moving product, right? So if I sold you maybe like 2 cases, which are like 50 units, and you sold that off in like a week or two for you to place a reorder in 2 weeks, that's great for me. I'm probably saying, all right, well, let's throw in a third case and see how that does. Let's throw in a fourth case. And trying to do that with every dispensary when you're like at 60, 70 dispensaries can be quite challenging. But that is helpful data because you can then see if it's a dispensary that's like, all right, you ordered 4, but now you're ordering 2. Do we need to activate in your store a little bit more? Do I need to like throw an event there, or do we need to come and do more product training with your employees there so that they kind of understand the brand a little bit more? That helps me just sort of know like what we're doing is going to be worth it for the next month. So that's like a top level KPI. Another one is if we're growing indoors and in dispensaries. So when we started back in May 2024, we were in our first like 20 doors, right? And maintained that. And then shortly after, by the end of the year, we got to about 65 doors, which was huge. But for a small team, that was like, it's like having 65 children, to be honest. Because you're trying to maintain, all the relationships. You're trying to maintain, any little issue. Every door can have one thing separate than the other. One might want some type of discount. One might want this. One might want that. So again, those top line figures for the brand, even before the splits, I also want to make my partners feel good about the relationship because they're taking on a huge part of building the brand. Them being able to see growth month over month or consistency will make them want to renew with you that next year, right? If it becomes more of a burden, they're producing product that's not selling and heading to the expiration graveyard, you're going to have tough conversations. So for me, like that anxiety that kind of like just sits right there. It's just each month knowing that like we've either met what we did last month in units sold or we've grown over that. Because then after that, you enter into your rev share and then you're able to say, all right, now I have this chunk of money. That stuff is just regular business, discretions, right? Being able to allocate it to whatever expenses you need to do, put money away for taxes, so on and so forth. So that's usually the main KPI I look for is just our door growth and our month over month, just growth sales.
All right, now I need to have a talk with your accountant because I have some like very specific questions on how does it look like if you bring on a customer or a wholesaler or somebody and you've sold them 1,000 units, like do we put 1,000 units sold and then I need to talk to an accountant to know that part.
Just trust me. Yeah. Talk to them, talk to Angela, talk to Tanika, because that's where I pass off the baton. But
Right.
really, again, like that just boils down to inventory.
Mm-hmm.
I don't deal with inventory as the brand. Now, some people do that take on, a little bit more. But like my retailer, so like my banking is so simple because it just shows like money coming in, right? Outside of the expenses going out. So every month there's just, a payment from your cultivator for what you made. And again, you should be receiving weekly and monthly reports to Corsair. So 5,500 units after rev shares, that's this amount, and then you can pay that. And then they keep track of those units. And going back to what I said, there's a track and trace system in there that also keeps track of that inventory. Where again, brands are asset light. This is why like the questions you have, you don't necessarily need to implement because that's what a traditional retailer needs to do, right? They need to maintain inventory. It's what a cultivator manufacturer needs to do. They need to maintain inventory. Wholesalers, brands, No.
Right. So we are finalizing this, the last 10 minutes. If any of you guys have questions, please drop them. But this is the question that we all want to know, since we're all accountants. What do you look for when you're hiring a potential accountant? Because I know you've worked with you've been in the industry for almost a decade now. So what exactly, and you've learned what you need and what you don't need. So what are you looking for?
My favorite type of accountant is the one that tells me you're not ready for me right now. I love that because that lets me know that they are looking at what the business can do as a whole, and they're looking at the priorities that the business should have, right? It's not just, all right, let me get you on retainer, let me get you on doing this, let me get you on do that. It's just that, all right, you actually just need to categorize payments or categorize transactions and do this and do that. And then you need me to come here and do this, this, and that. That type of accountant, I usually like to bring them and say, okay, me and you are here for the long term, because you're going to be able to look at the business and try to find ways to grow, try to find ways to be more operational sufficient. And I think that is like invaluable in an accountant. Outside of course, having like, just cannabis industry knowledge and understanding. I think just that willing to work with me as an entrepreneur in a new space and say, well, let's maybe think about doing things this way. Let's think about doing this way. It's just not the huge cash grab to get me on retainer. So that's usually something that I look for. I like an accountant who's willing to also show me how to utilize the platforms. I used to definitely want to be just hands off and just, all right, this is where the gambit stops with me. Like, I don't want to go into QuickBooks and touch all the buttons and do all the things, but like, will sit me down and be like, no, Precious, you have to know this. You have to understand this. You have to understand that. You have to understand that. Because then that pouring into me as an entrepreneur is also invaluable. So I look for that, because again, there's tons of service providers in cannabis now. There's tons of people that can do one thing or the next. I usually like to form a team that can like go the distance no matter what we get hit. It's like we were hit with an obstacle recently. Like, I've been out of market because of that packaging issue I mentioned, right? Like, sold all the packaging. I sat there and was like, well, I need more packaging, but my cash flow hasn't showed that I can make this huge lump sum deposit. Like, what are we going to do? I need someone that's going to be able to strategize and build from that, and not just say, oh, well, you're not in market, you're not getting any income. So I don't know what to do with you now at this point, right? So, so those are just some of the things that that I look for. But I've worked with amazing accountants. I've seen predatory accountants. I think just want to really help your client succeed is a telltale sign of a good professional.
Right. And then quickly, Angelita was asking, I think you're just in New Jersey, right?
I'm just in New Jersey. Yeah, definitely. I think Jersey is a great market for brands. Like, we're seeing retailers come online. So sadly, we're seeing some retailers start to close because that's where the saturation in the market is on that retail space. But something to keep in mind is that Jersey also has 70% of its market opted out of its cities. But we're starting to see some of those cities start to opt back in, which can probably expand that footprint of retailers into places that people have not had a dispensary or cannabis experience in, which makes it kind of very lucrative for brands, especially if with the handful of manufacturers, or more than a handful now, in cultivations that we do have, we have a decent supply chain balance where there's kind of an undersupply in product. We don't have enough canopy, I think, to cover where the market is, but there's a lot of sellers, right? I mean, there's a lot of buyers when it comes to retailers. So as a brand, like even me, if I like put my products out, there's 250. I just need a good 60 to purchase like a couple orders. So that helps me get through product really quickly. And again, I'm just trying to build that consistency before having to recreate this whole system in another state, which could be a completely different deal, a completely different market, so on and so forth. So kind of taking my time there. But again, still moving quickly to be a dominant brand in Jersey.
And that leads right into Jeffrey's question, because he's asking about supply and demand, and he's asking, do you limit the number of stores you sell, or try to limit the supply to increase demand?
So that was my original thought, right? I was like, all right, let me be this mysterious brand where like you can only find a limited amount of doors. I think that served us well our first couple months. I told you, like, we've seen that consistent rate in units sold. But then my strategy changed once I saw all these dispensaries start to pop up, right? I was like, all right, I think I want to get more units out the door. The ones that are selling are already there. Why, instead of casting smaller and going deeper, I changed my strategy to going wider and then a limited amount of doors. I mean, purchases. So for instance, in the beginning, I might have one door buying like 8, 9 cases, right? And like it might take them a little bit to sell through. Where now I have doors maybe buying 2, 3 cases, but that's spread wider and they can sell a lot faster, which can turn profit a lot quicker. And I think that's just gonna work. You can still have that level of exclusivity because some of these are kind of like far away. I kind of control the demographics. So if I'm super heavy in North Jersey in terms of doors, I'll try to like, centralize sales on either South or, Central West or something like that if my footprint isn't there. So yeah, I do play around with like supply demand in terms of sales and the doors because just making sure there's a solid footprint. But again, the goal for me, my KPI is that like my units are moving month over month.
Right. Awesome. And just to finalize this, what is next for you? Like, what do you
Yeah.
see over the next 2 to 3 years with Precious, or the brand and the person? What's going on?
So it's interesting. I've been in cannabis as an entrepreneur for so long. I was just talking to you about this before we jumped on. I'm navigating, like, building Precious in the brand is not the only thing I do, guys, right? I'm maintaining different contracts. I consult often. I do things to still help the cannabis industry, especially on the policy side. I'm really holding on to Precious because I am still one of those like Delulu people to think something could happen on the federal side when it comes to cannabis. Probably not immediate, maybe not even in the next 5 years, but maybe year 6, right? And I believe that companies that can still position themselves well enough to hold on to something that shows, again, just at least in the black or some level of growth, even if it's on a small scale by being in maybe 1 or 2 states, you can prepare yourself for exit. And that's something I don't think is talked about widely, especially in minority and black communities when it comes to building businesses, is exiting. Like, I don't want to build this company to operate it for the rest of my life. Like, it could be a family company, but I think I would actually want to position the brand for an exit and then can use that to go and do other things. So I'm really trying to, that's why a lot of the times when I think about the brand, I think to myself, I'm like, I'm really looking at maintenance, incremental scale, like strategic growth that's going to show consistency. Because I said the industry's changing, form factors are changing, not all businesses are thriving. So if there's a way I can maintain some level of consistency, and then in my Delulu world, I do think like, rescheduling may happen or, banking may happen or something that we've been working on for so long. I mean, just 2 days ago, we had the president talking about rescheduling, and that made national news, right? So whether he does it or not, we don't know, but it is still a topic of conversation. And I think just holding on to my business long enough for something like that to happen, I'll be in a really prime place to exit and then possibly be able to do something else.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time. I hope
Yeah.
everybody enjoyed this presentation.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I haven't got to talk about the brand at length in a minute because I've been like problem solving, but
Right.
it's been good
Well,
to share with you
hope you
guys. Thank you
have
so much.
okay,
Yeah, I
awesome. I
appreciate
look
it.
forward to seeing you around.
Likewise. Thank you, everyone. Enjoy.
Okay. Bye-bye.